I call it a yawner. I mean, that'd be the best way to explain it. Look, they needed to play it safe, and it was a very low bar. The reality is that, look, the elephant in the room, it's not addressing AI. That's what investors, that's what developers want to see. Innovate, innovate, innovate. Go after the install base, take some shots. Some of it will fail, some of it will be successful. I mean, this is the time for them to take more risks.
Once seen as an innovator in the tech field, Apple is now lagging behind when it comes to artificial intelligence. And Monday's Worldwide Developers Conference saw only cosmetic updates. To unbraid some of the challenges facing Tim Cook and the rest of the Apple C-suite, I'm joined now by Dan Ives. He's the global head of technology research at Wedbush Securities. Dan, you were there. What did you take away from the WWDC keynote specifically yesterday?
I mean, I call it a yawner. I mean, that'd be the best way to explain it. Look, they needed to play it safe, and it was a very low bar. Because if you go back a year ago, I mean, they came out of the gate strong with Apple Intelligence and basically had to walk back a lot of what they hoped to introduce. So this is really light on AI details, more focused on cosmetic, like you said, iOS 26, and some of the other sort of framework and developer issues. But the reality is that, look, the elephant in the room, it's not addressing AI. That's what investors, that's what developers want to see.
Put this in perspective. A year in this current technological field can feel like a lifetime. How far behind is Apple when it comes to artificial intelligence development?
They're behind. I mean, and look, to me, for the first time, and obviously the biggest company that they've ever acquired is Beats, 3.5 billion. They might be forced into doing M&A, a Perplexity or one of these other names from an AI perspective, because look, on one hand, you have a golden install base, best install base in the world, 2.4 billion iOS devices, 1.5 billion iPhones. You got to monetize an AI. Time's ticking. And look at Google, look at OpenAI, look at Microsoft. The list continues. I mean, right now they're way behind, and I think that's a concern for investors. And I'd say even from a consumer perspective, you need reasons to upgrade.
You mentioned investors, and they do seem pretty glum right now. Stock has slid, Apple stock that is, has slid over 20% since the first of the year. It's the worst run Apple shares have experienced in over a decade. So what can we make of Apple's AI plans here? What does the future look like?
Look, I think right now, I mean, like I said, they're playing it safe, close to the vest. I do think you'll have some bigger launch events probably later this year. Look, the goal is to basically have like an advanced Siri. I mean, really their own LLM, their own chat GPT that could really fly solo and is proprietary within the Apple ecosystem. Now, does that happen without an acquisition? That's the biggest question. But
I,
it comes down to like many times over the last decade, backspin against the wall. And Cook's come, I think back very impressively. He's going to have to do it again here.
I've been reading headlines, not just your take, but other takes, saying that Apple is really missing the boat here. And I was trying to think, what's the other side of this? And I was thinking maybe the generous side to Apple might be that AI actually isn't living up to the Apple brand, that Apple products are supposed to be easy to use, and maybe artificial intelligence, with some of the problems we've been seeing with ChatGPT, isn't as easy to use as techies might say it is. So is there an optimistic case? Could we see a turnaround here soon?
Yeah, part of the problem, and I like your angle. Part of the problem there is it's like me be looking at a party in Vegas from the outside, and it's raging at 2 a.m. And I say, it doesn't look that fun. I'm gonna go back to my hotel room and read a book. The reality is like it's a fourth industrial revolution. Apple needs to participate, and I do think maybe culturally in some of their standards, it's hurt them here. But look, the reality is they're going to have to accelerate this because it's the biggest technology innovation in the last 40, 50 years. And Apple can't be on the outside looking in.
Let's talk about some of the developments that, though small, were announced. One evolution here is that Apple's opening up its on-device AI model to third-party developers. But what is that really going to mean for iPhone and other device users?
Look, that's basically inviting developers basically to from an API perspective, trying to bring more and more models, more and more technology in. Because look, developers, that's the hearts and lungs of Apple's ecosystem. And that's really what they're trying to do there. I'd almost view it as like a band-aid approach, relative to some of the other issues that they're dealing with. And that's why they kind of did this sort of olive branch move, which I think was smart.
And of course, there wasn't any news missing around AI enhanced Siri. It seemed like a year ago that that was on the horizon. What's going on there?
Look, I mean, that was, yeah, I'd say if you look, probably one of the biggest missteps they've had in a long, long time. A lot of the stuff they promised, they had to walk back. And I think it's a black eye for Apple when you look at it. That's why here they wanted to just be so safe. I think too safe. And I think the reaction's kind of muted. I mean, when going to these events for many, many years, I mean, that was probably as, I'd say not as excited as I've seen developers in many, many years.
We see AI being used in some small ways. That seems to be part of this olive branch that you've mentioned. So is there a possibility, I know we've talked about this a little bit, but could Apple simply acquire an AI company? Would that fill the hole?
Well, look, like Perplexity, that would be a no-brainer. I mean, if they went after that. But look at OpenAI. OpenAI just acquired Johnny Ive, which I'd argue part of why Apple is where they are today because of Johnny Ive. OpenAI acquired that company 6.5 billion. Google's making acquisitions. Microsoft with OpenAI, IBM, Salesforce.com. I mean, the point is it goes on and on. So to sit there not acquiring with a company that basically has the capacity for call it 300 billion of acquisitions a year, I just think is not the smart move.
Apple really does seem to be getting outmaneuvered here in the AI sphere by other tech companies like Google and Meta. But then also you have these smart glasses where this is a product that also seems to be beyond what Apple can offer right now. In general, when we're stepping back, how do all of the offerings compare? Is Apple being left in the dust?
Look, I think they have an install base that's unrivaled, but I think they're a little on a treadmill from an innovation perspective. Look, and you've heard Zuckerberg and other take shots at Apple. And I think some of that's legit. I mean, look at some of the stuff Zuckerberg and Meta are doing. Look at Google's. Look at Microsoft. Look at names like Palantir. Look at Jensen from NVIDIA every day. So I do think the criticism's fair. And I think yesterday was maybe highlighted. In other words, a lot of what they were talking about and introducing, I felt like it was kind of like a time warp going back to like 2015.
Apple's also facing some regulatory challenges ahead, as well as courts in the US and Europe are poised to challenge part of its Apple Store business model. We've seen a shift from Apple relying more on services and less on goods. So what's at stake here with these cases?
Look, I mean, the regulatory headwinds. I continue to think I don't think there's going to be major business model changes, but it speaks to regulatory, right? Walls caving in. I mean, EU, US, and abroad. And look, but also it further speaks to they gotta do M&A and or be aggressive on AI.
Some of these news headlines are moving at the speed of light, it seems, but just a few weeks ago, we were talking about tariffs and what they could mean for Apple. How big of a threat are the current tariffs from the US on Chinese-made goods to Apple?
It's a threat. I mean, and it's a worry, right? I mean, like that's the vast majority of iPhones where they're produced, even though they pivoted to the assembly in India. And also, when you look at Apple, China's such a key market, 20% of demand. They're caught. I mean, you can say along with NVIDIA, but I think even more. I mean, they're caught front and center in this sort of Trump spotlight, Category 5 tariff storm. And that's also weighed on the stock. But Cook's 10% politician, 90% CEO.
Well, where does Apple go from here then? There's headwinds coming from, it seems like, all directions. So what does the rest of the year, the next 6, 9, 12 months look like?
Innovate, innovate, innovate. Go after the install base. Take some shots. Some of it will fail. Some of it will be successful. I mean, this is the time for them to take more risks than they've taken the last few years. And I think that's something investors will want to see them do.
Dan Ives joining us from Wedbush Securities. Thanks for getting off a red eye and speaking to us at DW Business.
Thank you.